A dusty, forgettable-looking oil painting leaning against a stack of broken picture frames at a thrift store can be worth hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. The exact same painting, priced at $2 because the frame is chipped and the colors look muddy under fluorescent lighting, can end up quietly funding a stranger's rent instead of yours. The difference between those two outcomes has nothing to do with how impressive the painting looks hanging on the wall, how big the canvas is, or whether the subject matter is even interesting to look at. It comes down to one detail almost everybody skips without realizing they're skipping it. What's actually written, stamped, or taped onto the back of the canvas. 7 paintings, 1 habit. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to look for on your own walls and in your own closets. Which paintings look so much like generic hotel decor that most people walk straight past them, and roughly what each one might actually be worth in today's market. Before we get into the list, build one habit right now, because everything in this video depends on it. Turn the painting around. Look at the back of the canvas, the stretcher bars, and the frame itself. That's the entire secret hiding underneath more than a century of forgotten artwork. A dull, brownish landscape painting with nothing visible on the back is usually decorative filler worth almost nothing, no matter how old it looks. The exact same painting, same size, same muddy palette, same unremarkable subject, but with a gallery label, a signature, or an old inventory stamp on the reverse, can be worth hundreds or thousands of dollars to the right buyer. Nobody teaches you this, and nobody selling you mass-produced canvas prints at a home decor store has any reason to tell you either. That entire industry survives on convincing you that a picture is just a picture, that what matters is whether it matches your couch. Nobody in that business benefits from you finding out that a warped, yellowed old painting sitting behind a stack of frames in a thrift store back room might be worth more than anything hanging in their showroom right now. And this isn't some tiny hobby that only a handful of art world insiders care about. Thrift store and estate sale painting discoveries have become a genuine phenomenon over the last several years, with ordinary people stumbling into 4-figure and even 6-figure finds simply because they knew to check a signature or flip a canvas over. That pattern is exactly why prices on overlooked categories of vintage and antique paintings have climbed the way they have, because more buyers now understand that ugly and worthless are not the same thing. So we're doing this differently. We're starting with the paintings so easy to mistake for generic wall filler that people genuinely believe they're worthless, and working our way up to the detail that has fooled more thrift store buyers than anything else hanging on a wall in America. Let's start with number 7, competitive, unsigned 19th and early 20th century landscape and still life paintings, sometimes nicknamed brown sauce paintings by dealers because of their muted, varnished, darkened color palette. These are the paintings people walk past without a second glance, because they genuinely do look like generic hotel room decor. A murky forest scene, a bowl of fruit, a ship on a stormy sea. Here's what most people don't check. Turn the canvas around and look at the stretcher bars, the wooden frame the canvas is pulled across. Older stretchers were hand-cut and joined at the corners with visible hand tool marks, while modern reproduction frames use uniform machine-cut joints. Look at the canvas edge itself where the paint meets the frame. Genuine older paint sits in slightly raised dimensional brushstrokes you can feel with a fingertip in raking light, while a printed reproduction is completely flat no matter how textured the surface looks. A well-executed, anonymous 19th century oil landscape in good condition regularly sells in the $400 to $1,500 range, purely on the strength of its age, technique, and condition, with no famous name required at all. If you own a dark, unsigned landscape you assumed was mass-produced decoration, run your finger across the surface before you decide. Number 6. Depression-era paintings created under government-funded art programs in the 1930s and 1940s. These pieces are often small, painted on cheap available materials, and depict ordinary scenes: factory workers, rural towns, farm labor, city street corners. Because the materials were modest and the subject matter unglamorous, people assume these are amateur hobby paintings with no real history behind them. What they're actually looking at, in some cases, is government-commissioned artwork from a specific historical period when out-of-work artists were paid to paint the country around them, work that is now actively collected specifically because it captured a slice of American life nobody else was documenting at the time. Look on the back for a stenciled number, a faded paper label, or handwritten inscriptions referencing a project or a regional office. That kind of documentation is exactly the provenance trail collectors chase. Depending on the artist and the documentation attached, these paintings commonly sell in the hundreds of dollars, and pieces tied to artists who later became recognized have climbed considerably higher. If you own a small, plain-looking painting of ordinary working life from that era, the plainness is not a red flag. It might be the entire point. Number 5. Folk art and self-taught artist paintings. These are some of the most confidently dismissed paintings on this entire list, because the style itself trips people up. Flattened perspective, bold unblended color, a slightly naive, almost childlike rendering of people and animals. Most buyers see that and assume amateur hour, something a hobbyist knocked out on a rainy weekend. Self-taught and folk artists, including a number of celebrated indigenous and regional American painters, often worked in exactly that visual language deliberately, and their paintings are collected specifically for that direct, unpolished quality rather than in spite of it. The identifying clue here usually isn't in the brushwork at all, it's in the details around the piece. A name signed in the corner that doesn't ring a bell, or a handwritten note taped to the back describing the scene. One widely reported thrift store find involved a small painting of a truck driving through snow, bought for $8, with nothing more than a strip of tape on the back reading a short handwritten caption. Once the buyer researched the signature, it turned out to belong to a recognized Native American artist and war veteran whose work has sold at auction for hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars. If you own a simple, somewhat unpolished-looking painting with an unfamiliar signature, don't assume unpolished means amateur. Look the name up before you decide. Number 4. School of and follower paintings, meaning pieces painted in the style of a famous historical artist by a student, workshop assistant, or admirer, rather than by the master himself. These paintings often carry dark, heavily varnished surfaces and dramatic religious, historical, or portrait subject matter, the kind of thing that looks like it belongs in a museum basement rather than someone's living room, which is exactly why people assume it's a cheap, mass-produced copy. The giveaway here is age evidence rather than a name. Look for genuine cracklure, the fine, irregular network of surface cracks that develops naturally in old paint and varnish over centuries, which is extremely difficult to fake convincingly. Look also for old restorer or framer labels on the back. Historic paintings frequently carry small printed or handwritten labels from long-defunct picture restoration shops, sometimes over a century old, which act as a rough dating tool even without an artist's name attached. These pieces don't need to be by the famous name they resemble to carry real value. A competently executed, genuinely old school of work with solid provenance can sell for well over $1,000, and in rare documented cases, pieces initially dismissed as anonymous copies have been reattributed and sold for tens of thousands, once a specialist traced the technique back to a specific studio or region. If you own a dark, heavily varnished old painting that looks like a forgotten copy of something famous, check for cracklure and old labels before writing it off as decoration. Number 3. Signed works by regional, listed American artists, meaning painters who exhibited, sold, and built a documented career, but never became household names. This is where a lot of real money hides in plain sight, because the name means absolutely nothing to the average person holding the painting. A signature that looks unfamiliar gets treated as if it's meaningless, when in reality, thousands of regional and mid-century American artists have documented auction histories sitting in searchable databases most people have never heard of, cataloging signatures from well over 500,000 artists. The habit here is simple: photograph the signature clearly and actually search it instead of assuming an unfamiliar name means an unknown artist. A signed regional American landscape with a documented auction history commonly sells in the $2,000 to $15,000 range, a number that surprises most people who assumed only globally famous names carried real value. If you own a signed painting by a name you've genuinely never heard of, that unfamiliarity is not evidence against it. It might just mean nobody's looked it up yet. Number 2. Paintings carrying old gallery labels, exhibition stickers, or auction house lot numbers on the back, regardless of what the front of the canvas actually looks like. This is arguably the single most overlooked category on this entire list, because almost nobody ever turns a painting around to check. Collectors and appraisers have a saying for this: the back tells the truth. A gallery label typically lists the artist's name, the title of the work, a date, and sometimes an inventory number and the address of the gallery or exhibition where it was shown. And an auction house sticker with a lot number can often be traced directly back through that house's historical sale records. This is exactly how some of the most dramatic thrift store discoveries in recent memory actually got confirmed. In one widely reported case, a painting purchased at a New Hampshire thrift store for a few dollars sat forgotten for years until a label found on the back of the frame led researchers to exhibition records, tying it to a major American illustrator. and the piece ultimately sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. Not every label leads to a six-figure result, obviously, but even a modest, traceable provenance trail can add meaningful value to an otherwise unremarkable-looking painting. If a painting in your home has any sticker, stamp, or handwritten label on the back that you've always ignored, that's not clutter. That's the provenance trail collectors are actively hunting for. And number one, the detail that fools more people than anything else on this entire list. A genuine signature by a well-known or historically significant artist that gets dismissed on the spot simply because it feels too good to be true. This happens constantly, and it happens for a very specific psychological reason. People assume that if a famous name were really sitting in a thrift store bin or a stack of old frames, someone smarter would have found it first. So when a recognizable name turns up on a painting bought for a few dollars, the instinct is to assume it's a coincidence, a forgery, or a cheap print with a printed signature, and the painting goes right back into the discount pile. That assumption has been proven wrong often enough that it should genuinely worry you. A work mechanic once spotted a painting online signed with a famous impressionist name from an early, less recognizable period in that artist's career, dismissed by nearly everyone else as too implausible to be real, and it was later supported by historical records as a genuine early work. A factory worker used an unsigned still life to cover a hole in his wall for years before recognizing the style from a card game and eventually having it identified as a major American painter's lost work, worth over $1 million. The pattern every single time is the same. The signature or the style looked too impressive for the setting it was found in, so it got ignored. Of everything on this list, this is the one most likely to be sitting in your own house right now. Dismissed the moment someone decided it looked too good to be genuine. So what actually connects all 7 of these paintings? Every single one of them was overlooked because it didn't look the way people expect valuable art to look. Muddy and dark instead of bright and impressive. Small and plain instead of large and dramatic. Naive and simple instead of technically polished. Heavily varnished and copy-like instead of pristine. Signed by a stranger instead of a household name. Blank looking on the back instead of obviously important. And in the most dramatic cases, signed by a name so famous that people assumed it had to be fake. Run back through those 7 for a second and notice the pattern in how each one hides. The unsigned landscape hides behind looking like hotel decoration. The Depression-era piece hides behind cheap materials and plain subject matter. The folk art painting hides behind a style people mistake for amateur work. The school of painting hides behind dark varnish and an assumption that it must be a copy. The regional listed artist hides behind a name nobody's bothered to search. The labeled painting hides behind the simple fact that nobody ever turns it around. And the famous signature hides behind the sheer disbelief that it could possibly be real. Every single one of them is hiding for a different reason, and every single one of them is found the exact same way. You turn it over, and you actually look. Now let me be completely honest with you, because that's the only reason this channel works the way it does. Not every ordinary-looking painting is secretly worth a fortune, and it would be dishonest to let you believe otherwise. Condition changes everything here. Torn canvas, flaking paint, heavy water damage, or amateur overpainting can cut a painting's value down to a small fraction of what a clean example brings. Attribution matters just as much. A signature alone doesn't guarantee authenticity. Signatures have been added to unrelated paintings, forged outright, or simply belong to a different unrelated person with the same name, which is exactly why serious buyers cross-reference signatures against documented auction records instead of taking them at face value. So if you genuinely believe you found something significant, it's worth having a specialist or an accredited appraiser examine it in person before you assume its value or try to sell it. But here's the math that makes this worth your time anyway. Turning a painting around and actually reading what's stamped, written, or labeled on the back costs you nothing. No appointment, no fee, no expertise required, just a few minutes and a decent light. Selling a genuinely documented painting for $2 at a yard sale because nobody bothered to check the back costs you everything that painting was actually worth. So before anything else leaning against your closet wall goes into a donation pile, a dumpster, or a $2 folding table in somebody's driveway, take the time to turn every single canvas around and actually read what's written on the back. Tell me in the comments which of these 7 paintings sounds like something sitting in your own home, and describe it if you can. I read every comment on these videos. And whatever else you do this week, don't get rid of a single painting from that closet until you've checked.